For those who missed Anthony's introduction, my name is Ed Dorrell. I'm Head of Content and, somewhat less prosaically, Deputy Editor of the TES, also known as the Times Education Supplement, also known as TES, depending on who you are. I was delighted to be invited to chair this debate, and what is exciting about this is it really is going to be a debate. It's not going to be a panel conversation, it's going to be everyone being nice to each other. Hopefully, we're going to have a row. And if there isn't one, I'll start one. But I really want you guys to engage with this debate. It's a live issue. The people in the audience won't need me to tell them and explain to them why this is such a live issue for not just universities, but colleges and schools with sixth forms, and in fact, wider society. There'll be bonus points for the first person to say snowflake. Yes, awarded to myself. We have a brilliant panel. 2 debate teams, shall we say. I'm going to introduce them. Then we're going to go to you guys for a vote. Then we'll have the debate. And then we're going to go back to you for a vote, and we'll try and judge whether your thoughts have been skewed or slayed or changed by what's gone on. So, in no particular order, except the order in which they're speaking, we have, speaking for the motion, Chris Ramsey, who is, I'm pleased to say, a head of an actual school at this and 18th festival.
Thank you, Anthony.
He's head of Whitgift School, which is a very large and renowned school in Croydon. It is an independent school, and as such, it is a member of the HMC, and Chris is chairman of the University Committee of the HMC. So whenever you see anyone from independent schools shouting their mouths off about HE, Chris has to come in and kind of finesse the line. Nobody mentioned. I won't
school
mention
not far from here.
Next up, we have Joanna Williams, who's speaking against the motion, who is head of education and culture at Policy Exchange, the organisation we're not to describe as right-leaning.
I haven't said that.
Right-leaning think tank.
Appropriate speech, Ed, you can say what you like.
Then we have Nick Hillman, who I guess needs no introduction in this kind of place, but he's director of HEPI. And then last but not least, we have Johnny Rich, who is described slightly prosaically as an HE and careers consultant.
Okay.
Is that reasonable?
Fair enough.
Okay, right. So the motion we are going to discuss is this House believes 18-year-olds are still children, and it doesn't really need to be said, but not adults. So, put your hand up if you believe 18-year-olds are still children. Hands in the air, please. Right.
Oh, sorry.
Would anyone on my panel disagree that that's about a third? Third to a quarter? Okay, and against? We're going to say that's half. So there's a group yet to be decided. So each of the speakers is going to have 5 minutes opening remarks, then debate, and then closing remarks, then vote again. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand the lectern to one Chris Ramsey.
Thanks very much, Ed. It feels a bit, doesn't it, this marquee, like it might be set up for speech day or a prom. And this time of year, it's easy to forget what happens or what's going to happen in a couple of months. And we've all been there, haven't we, I guess, the arrival at university. Now, some years ago, the excellent television dramatist Jack Rosenthal wrote a play called Eskimo Day, a play about arrival at university, during which Maureen Lipman's character says, and I quote, "It's Eskimos, isn't it, that when they get old and no use to anyone anymore, they quietly sling their hooks and toddle off into the snow for good, and their kids don't bother because life goes on and they're adults." Well, are they? Arrival at university in September, October used to be strictly go now please to mum and dad, and you would never see a parent at an open day. Now, University of Warwick, for example, has to take over most of Canley as a park and ride for 4x4s on its open day, and parent drop-off has become a chaperoned move-in at most halls of residence. So, when the moment comes to start being a student, for which I'm using the shorthand of being an 18-year-old, are you an adult or are you still a child? Nick and I are going to argue that you're not yet fully an adult. And although we wouldn't dispute, I think, the claim as commentators such as Frank Furedi, for example, that young people shouldn't be infantilized, we would dispute the age-old cry of the university, well, he or she is an adult now. This East German border guard blockage has actually personally happened to me. My oldest son at 18 went to on an excellent student exchange scheme for his university. When he hadn't contacted us 48 hours after his arrival in China, as it happens, was due, and hadn't obviously even told us exactly where he was going or staying, we contacted the university. Had he arrived safely at their partner university? Had he booked in to the accommodation? Was he all right? The answer, we're not allowed to tell you. He's an adult. Yes, and also a boy, and his father a teacher. So I hacked into his email, found his booking in details, called them, and they were delighted to relieve us in the Chinese university that he was fine, but had lost his phone and there wasn't any Wi-Fi. Of course, joking apart, even students themselves say they're unprepared for adult life. As long ago as 1994, the sociologist Jeffrey Arnett surveyed college students on their conception of themselves as adults. Only 23%, he found, indicated they considered themselves to have reached adulthood. 2/3 indicated they considered themselves to be adults in some respects, but not in others. The most important criteria, this is from his report, for marking the transition to adulthood were intangible criteria. Things like accepting responsibility for the consequences of your actions, deciding on beliefs and values independently of parents or other influences, and establishing a relationship with your parents as an equal adult, each of which were endorsed by only about 50% of the sample. Role transitions such as completing education, marriage, and becoming a parent were endorsed by less than 20%, perhaps unsurprisingly. It is suggested, he concluded, that the transition from adolescence to adulthood in Western societies is a process that lasts many years, during which individualistic and intangible markers of adulthood are gradually and incrementally pursued. So, I argue, in reality, this is not a dichotomy. It's a journey. It's a continuum. In schools, we see the same at 11 plus and at 16 plus. Some of our new Year 7, 11-year-olds are clearly big school ready. Others are still little boys and girls. Some 16-year-olds are definitely sixth form students. Others are still whispering at the back of the classroom and asking how long the homework is supposed to take. Why then should 18 plus be the only cliff edge in our society? And it's really odd, isn't it? As a society, we seem to be pushing adulthood onto young people more and more, and earlier and earlier. Some of us want them to vote. We want them to drive. We buy adult clothes for them, younger and younger ages. And they tell us they're stressed. Perhaps there's some cause and effect. Perhaps we should take more time to help them develop into full adulthood, which actually is practically being recognised at some of our best universities. Bristol University is surely only the first in a tidal wave of those who invite students to involve their parents in their welfare. 94% of Bristol students have opted to have their parents informed and involved if the university is worried. And that near universal realization that these young people at 18 are not fully fledged adults has of course done Bristol much public good to help repair the public harm done by their previous "these are adults" policy. So of course, in a way, 18-year-olds are beginning to be adults, young adults if you like, as of course some 16-year-olds are too. Some 13-year-olds are pretty adult. But to push them into full adulthood when some of them have never lived away from home before, never cooked a meal, never booked their own tickets, and still, more importantly, don't know who they are or what life about is wrong. Yes, university should be the start of adulthood, but not a door on support closed. Thank you.
Right, take notes, everybody. That was 5.5 minutes on the spot. Joanna Williams.
Thank you. So at risk of upsetting Ed, who clearly seems to want a bloodbath this morning, I have to say I probably agree with far more of what Chris has said than disagree with it. So my eldest two children are 20 and 18, and I'm sure anybody who's a parent or anybody who's had experience of working with young people will know that they are all very, very different. So whereas my 20-year-old is incapable of leaving the house and taking a key with him, who is completely scatterbrained and I would not treat as an adult to save my life, my 18-year-old is so scarily mature, I feel as if he's brought me up for the past 10 years rather than the other way round. But the point I really want to make today is that I think I agree that 18-year-olds are not fully formed. There's not some magic thing that clicks in on the eve of your 18th birthday and you magically overnight transition from being a child and immature, and then you wake up the next day and like magic, you're magically suddenly this mature, fully formed adult ready to take on the world and knowing who you are. I mean, blimey, if that's the criteria of adulthood, I seriously question myself sometimes. So there's nothing magic that happens on the eve of your 18th birthday. But I think what I want to defend more than anything else this morning is the aspiration and the expectation that we try to see 18-year-olds as adults. Because I think, again, as anybody who's had experience of young people knows, they live up to our expectations of them. If we set high expectations for children of any age, they do better than if we set low expectations of them. So I think that's my key message. We should treat 18-year-olds as adults. We should expect them to be adults, whilst at the same time providing a safety net in case they fall. The other key point I really want to make is that what we think about adulthood then is culturally conditioned. So if you think it was just a few weeks ago, just earlier this month, that we were commemorating D-Day, the D-Day anniversary in this country. And quite tragically, as people will know, there were countless numbers of 18-year-olds who were signed up, enlisted in both the First and the Second World War, who fought and died as adults. And they were very much seen as being young, but definitely adults. And particularly before the First World War, these young adults were themselves wanting to be adults. I mean, this was before, obviously, the horror of the trenches, the horror of the Somme was fully known, but the expectation that you as an 18-year-old could play a role in fighting for your country, that you could be taken seriously as an adult, was something that they expected. So I've said there's no fixed biological point at which suddenly you transition and become an adult. It's a process which takes place over a number of years. And I guess what I would argue is that we have changed as a society, and some of the key markers that help people along the road to the transition to adulthood, we've removed from children. So I guess I'm thinking about things like the ability to travel independently away from home as a child. And geographers have actually mapped the distance that children, say at the age of 7, can venture on their own. So if you go back to the 1970s, it was quite common for 7-year-olds to walk to school on their own, to be able to go to the park on their own, to meet up with friends. Gradually, every single year since the 1970s, the distance that 7-year-olds are allowed to travel on their own has shrunk. And now, it's sadly, I think, it's not much further than their own back garden. Most 7-year-olds have not had that experience of being able to go alone to school, to the park, to the shop. We've restricted the terrain for 7-year-olds. Take 13-year-olds. When I was 13, I had a Saturday job. Very few 13-year-olds today have Saturday jobs. Even if they want one, they're not always easy to come by. We've raised the school leaving age from 16 to 18. 17, 18-year-olds nowadays are expected to be in some form of education and training. Now, we might argue that this is a very good thing as a society, but effectively it takes away that autonomous choice. 17-year-olds are not actively choosing to be in education. They're there because they're told to be. They're there as minors being ordered and instructed by the state, if you like, how they should lead their lives. So at every stage, when young people should be making decisions for their lives themselves, should be learning gradually to become more independent, to take control, to take responsibility, to be able to make decisions about their lives. As a culture, as a society, we've prevented young people from having these opportunities. Older teenagers, 17-year-olds in sixth form, 18-year-olds going to university, are increasingly seen as vulnerable. That the very fact of being a teenager, of making the transition to university nowadays, is enough to mark you out as being vulnerable. And I think the problem with this is that young people arrive at university now, 18, 19-year-olds, not with a full set of life skills, which they may well have had if they'd been allowed to develop those skills. Yeah, just 1 minute. If they'd been allowed to develop those skills throughout their childhood, and they arrive with this perception of themselves as being vulnerable, as still being children. Adulthood is not presented to young people as an aspiration, as something exciting, as something positive, as freedom, as this exciting, tantalizing prospect of being able to take control and shape the direction of your own life. It's presented to young people as you are vulnerable, and adulthood is really scary and horrible, and most adults don't want to do it, so you shouldn't have this aspiration to be an adult yourself. So it's perhaps unsurprising then that they almost seek a return to in loco parentis. Rather than arriving saying, we're adults now, leave us alone, they're arriving saying, please look after us. I know Ed's getting cross, I'll just make one more point. If we treat students as these vulnerable young people incapable of looking after themselves, that's how they act. By treating first-year students still as children, they will act like children. And we need to have this expectation that they are moving on to adulthood. Again, I stress, with a safety net. Thank you. Sorry, Ed.
Nick Hillman.
Well, thank you very much for being here. This is co-hosted by HEPI, this event, and it's one of the best. The festival is, this debate is co-hosted by HEPI, but this festival is one of my favourite events of the year, and I live in Buckingham, so it's my local university as well, so it's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you to all of you for coming so early. It was interesting, because I was driving over here this morning. I was listening to the Today programme. It was before Anthony was on, and they were talking about prisons and the challenge in prisons faced by young prisoners, particularly prisoners who are over 18 but still very young. And there was a fascinating conversation. I'm going to talk mainly about education, but it shows that this challenge of needing to give 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds proper support and not treating them as completely independent beings is a really important thing that goes way beyond education. But I want to really talk about some history, not as far back as Joanna, not back to the Somme, but back within our lifetime, back to the 1970s, because until the 1970s, the law changed in 1970, the age at which you legally became an adult was 21. And that meant young undergraduates arriving at university were not fully fledged adults. And it meant that universities had a much greater duty of care towards their students than most universities have or feel they have today. Now, yeah, look, some of the results of that were absurd. There were curfews on students in halls of residence. There were limits on who you were allowed in your room. A 1969 report from the National Union of Students found some students were told when they could have a bath, when they could use lights, when they were allowed to use cooking facilities. But in 1970, there was a report by Justice Leahy saying it had become absurd and that the age of majority should fall to 18. But, you know, when they recommended that as a legal change, it wasn't meant to herald the world that we have. And the report said colleges will, by which it meant universities as well, will continue to require that young people do not enjoy themselves with trumpets and strumpets to the point where it keeps other people awake, which I think is a fairly good lesson for certainly halls of residence, maybe boarding schools as well. But universities use that change to the law, which happened just before I was born, I think to start taking too little, it was a gradual process, but to start taking too little interest in their students. And it's only until the last few months, as Chris, my colleague on the proposition, said, that universities have really rowed back on a lot of this. And, for example, asked students for permission to contact their parents for mental health conditions. And I think this is exactly what they should be doing, because this is what students themselves want. And we published just 2 weeks ago the Student Academic Experience Survey. You can get a free copy from our stall next door. And one of the findings in there, the one the journalists were most interested in fact, was that 80% of students, roughly, want their universities to contact their parents or guardian when they suffer a mental health condition, because they want that support. Secondly, another case, a lawyer said to me recently they'd come across an individual who'd been banned from teaching in every single school in the country for doing sort of, hugely inappropriate things with their young charges in school. And that person walked straight into a teaching job in a British university. And because, 18-year-olds in universities are adults, it was deemed an acceptable thing to do. I don't think students think that's acceptable. I don't think their parents think that's acceptable. I don't think society would regard that as acceptable. So I think it's all rather silly, because aging is a process. It's not a one-off cliff edge. And our policies as a country should reflect that. And, in truth, they sometimes do. So you might think Chris and I are arguing a very old-fashioned, traditionalist, paternalistic argument, but it's not so far from current practice in every respect as you might think. So, for example, if you've got students, children at university, you'll know you're expected to contribute towards their financial costs. That's true even if they're age 24 when they go to university. Local authorities with children in care have a duty to look after care leavers until they're in their mid-20s as well. So my argument is that the effects of that change half a century ago to lower the age of majority have gone too far. And let me end with a thought experiment. Imagine that we raised the age of majority back to 21, but that we got rid of any ludicrous things that would just be so out of place in 2019, like curfews and who you can have in your room and bath times. What would be left? I contend what would be left would be a more supportive environment in our educational institutions than has typically been in place at universities up and down the UK. And I think that's what we should be aiming for, because I think the concept of a cliff edge is absurd. And no one is saying we should return to the bad old days, but there is a happy halfway house between where we have been and where we could be in terms of caring for our students. And I think new technology helps in this regard as well. Anybody who knows about the power of big data in education, I hope would agree with that. So if you think the current rules are absurd, and 80% of students do, then you need to support Chris and I on the proposition. Thank you.
Last but not least, Johnny Witt.
Thank you. So the proposition's case seems to rest on the fact that 18-year-olds aren't very old, which is true, and that universities have a duty of care towards them, which is true. But let's remind ourselves what the words of the motion actually are. This House believes 18-year-olds are still children and not adults. Not young adults, not adolescents, children is what it says. I remember being 18. It was quite a long time ago for me. I expect many of you remember, and it probably wasn't quite as long for many of you. But if someone had called me a child at 18, they meant it as a deliberate insult. I was old enough to vote, to work, to pay taxes, to get married, to drink, to drive, preferably not at the same time, to die for my country, as we heard. Just about the only thing I wasn't old enough to do was drive an articulated vehicle, which I still can't do, by the way. And the wording of this motion asks us to insult 18-year-olds, call them children. It's not an insult because 18-year-olds are oversensitive or have ideas above their station, are snowflakes. There.
Good point.
Thank you. It's insulting because it infantilizes them. Literally, this motion is the very definition of the word infantilize. The motion could have been, this House believes we should infantilize 18-year-olds. Treating someone as a child, especially when legally they are not, is to deprive them of the dignity of self-determination. of agency, which is the very thing that many people go to university to get, that sense of self-determination. It is to treat young people as if they cannot and should not make sensible decisions about their own lives. And what do we achieve by treating them as children? I'm a parent. So are, in fact, everybody on the panel is a parent. And as a parent, I totally understand the desire to protect young people, to protect my children from every single harm, to take away all possible pain, inconvenience that we all suffer by just living. I often want to wrap my kids in cotton wool, but I can't. And social services tell me I shouldn't use duct tape either. But the best way to ensure your children are safe as they grow up is to let them make mistakes in a safe environment. Let them learn from those mistakes. Give them the support so that they don't make the mistakes at critical moments when it really matters. And then when they do anyway, pick them up when they fall over. Allow them to develop resilience, grit, self-reliance. Treating people like children ensures that they remain children. If parents should learn to let their children grow up, how much more so is that true for universities? On this very platform a year ago, Sam Gyimah, the then universities minister, suggested that universities should be in loco parentis. I disagree. Students don't want to be parented by their universities, and it's not fair to ask universities to take that role either. Parenting is hard enough when you are a parent. It's nearly impossible when you're not actually a parent, particularly when your so-called child doesn't want or need you to be a parent. Being in loco parentis places an unreasonable and unachievable expectation on universities. It sets them up to fail. But does any of this mean we shouldn't have this duty of care? Does any of this mean that we should stop caring for people or guiding people when they reach a certain age? Of course not. It is a process. That's not what I'm saying. Becoming an adult is a gradual process. Even adults need and want to be looked after and cared for sometimes. Am I saying universities have no duty of care to their students? Of course not. I'm saying that caring shouldn't be something that can only be done by parents and only done to children. Universities have a duty of care to their employees too, but no one expects them to parent them. Universities are communities. And like any caring community, they should offer help to the members of that community who need it, whoever they are, ideally before they feel the need to ask for help. The kind of support that a young adult might need may well be different from the support that an aging academic might need. But it doesn't mean we should treat either of them like a child. Think about an old people's home. Do you think the residents should be treated as children because they need care and support? I hope not. Personally, I think that would be an insult to their dignity, and the same goes for 18-year-olds. As a society, we could learn a lot about mutual respect and building stronger, caring communities. I also believe we could learn a lot by respecting teenagers a great deal more. When I was invited to speak in this debate, I said I'd be honoured to if they got desperate. Clearly they did. But I suggested that they shouldn't have old farts like us. If you want somebody to prove to you that an 18-year-old is an adult, ask an 18-year-old. You don't have to listen for long to the likes of Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai when she was 18, or any of the many fantastic young campaigners arguing for reducing the voting age, to realise that we treat children as children. We treat young people as just children at our peril. Please don't infantilise students. Please don't insult them. Please vote against the motion. Thank you.
A bit of motion redefining.
Right, I'm going to come to you guys in 1 minute, but I'm going to take the chair's prerogative. I'm going to ask each side one question of my own. So let's argue in favour of the motion. Where does it end? If they're still children at 18, or you've got parental duty. Let me finish the question. And more importantly, the question is about...
2 questions.
The question is about... the debate is about children. It doesn't say universities. So a young adult doing an apprenticeship at Barclays, at what point does Barclays stop being in loci parentis?
So first of all, the reason I talked about higher education is because this is the festival of higher education. So it seemed an appropriate.
I know,
it seemed
but
an
the
appropriate
debate was
topic.
about children, not about.
And secondly, when does it end? Joanna gave you the answer in her speech. It's different for every person. It's different for every person. I mean, for example, boys' brains mature more slowly than girls' brains. So there may be a gender aspect to this. There may be someone with learning needs. It may be much later than for others. Someone, a care leaver, may be later for others. Interestingly, in our survey, when we said to students, should your parents or guardian be contacted with mental health conditions, an overwhelming majority, even of mature students, over the age of 26 said yes. So it may be different for different issues and different for different people.
So we have a different age
There's
majority.
no cliff edge. That is our point. There is no cliff edge.
Joanna, and then you.
Thank you. So I did say, I confess, I did say in my introduction that I thought people matured at different rates. Actually, both of my oldest children are boys, so there's no gender differentiation there. But I think this is why we do, as a society and as a culture, of course it's artificial. You know, wherever we choose to set the point, be it 21, 18, 16, wherever we draw the line, as you are now an adult, it is going to be artificial. But of course, we have to draw that line somewhere. We have to say that this is the point at which, in society, you are officially recognised as an adult. In our society, we choose 18, and I agree, I think it should be 18. Of course, what we can't do is kind of give everybody brain scans, you know, oh, are you ready to drive yet? Okay, let's go, and we'll put you into this CT scan, and we'll see whether your prefrontal cortex is fully developed or not. You know, waiting to go and vote in the election, we'll have this brain scanner there. I mean, to listen to some people in response to the referendum, you kind of get the impression some people wish this was the case. But we don't have brain scanners. And if we did have brain scanners, it would probably rule out a whole lot of people who we consider to be adults at the moment. So yes, 18 is artificial. Yes, people mature at different rates. But we need, as a society and a culture, we need an artificial deadline. We know it's artificial, but it has to be there, and it should be 18.
I just think we've extrapolated something interesting from the words of the motion, which are all about childhood and adulthood, and suddenly parenting is being introduced as if it's sort of something, this kind of demonic thing that's a terrible insult to people. And I just encourage us to think of, you know, being in loco parentis or looking after other people. It doesn't have to be patronising. And there's a sort of, I think we must not get into the danger of thinking that by saying we believe 18-year-olds are still children, that means that everybody has to be holding their hand as they cross the road and so on and so forth. So I just encourage us to get away from the parenting as being something terrible line. Being in loco parentis, which a lot of people are, schools, universities, employers, apprenticeship providers and so on and so forth. It can be an incredibly big privilege and a great thing, not a bad thing.
Right, before I come to my question for these guys, let's see some hands in the air, please. Oh, when you chair things, it's always a relief when you see some hands go up. I'm going to start at the front with there's two ladies in black and white checks, so that's quite confusing. The nearest lady in black and white check. Would you mind saying who you are, unless you definitely don't want to? And please, can it be a question?
Hi, I'm Sarah Louise Johnston. I work in Student First or Student Welfare in the University of Buckingham. I'm a psychologist. So I agree with you about the individual differences for different people, but can I ask you, what can universities do to help their students become more responsible and more like adults?
Right, I'm going to go to you, Johnny, because you didn't have your say in the first round.
Universities can support their students in many different ways, and providing an education. I mean, the closeness of the word university and the word universal, I think, should imply that universities are there about developing you as a rounded person. That actually is exactly what employability is about, is developing as a rounded person. It's something that we kind of make akin to adulthood, is the idea of being a rounded person. And this means providing a supportive and caring environment. But that doesn't mean treating them as children. You do not support people by keeping them pressed down as children, especially when they wouldn't define themselves as children.
Okay, one of you guys. normally?
I always think the single best thing universities can do is find ways of getting to know the students as individuals, their strengths and weaknesses. And I think if I have there's loads of things that I would criticise in schools, but one of the things I would criticise in some universities is they sometimes treat all of their undergraduates as if they were all the same. And I think, the more they can know them as individuals, by whatever means, tutorial or whatever, that's the single biggest thing they could do.
Okay, let's see another hand in the air, please. Yes, this lady, please. Say who you are.
Hi, Michelle Morgan. I have a comment and then a question for the panel. I think my frustration is that 18-year-olds today are seen to be a totally different type of 18-year-old to 30 years ago or 50 years ago. We've seen massification in higher education, and by the massification, we're going to get behaviour that's happened coming through into university. And I talk about my situation back in 1984. I was anorexic. I tried to commit suicide at 17. 33 years later, I was on a student panel listening to a vlogger who was invited. 33 years separated us, our stories were identical. So I refute that 18-year-olds have any less challenges. We're seeing more of it in higher education as a result of the massification. The question to the panel is, are universities just terrified of knowing how to deal with it, being able to deal with it, having the resources to deal with it, and actually terrified that if for whatever reason we do take on that parental responsibility, if we fail, we're at the forefront of legal action?
So are universities just scared, Nick?
I think they are scared. I mean, we've been very positive as an organisation about, for example, the disclosure point I made, telling parents and guardians where there's been mental health conditions. What universities push back and they say is, what if we get it wrong? What if we decide not to tell the parent and it turns out it's a terrible catastrophe? What if we do tell the parent and actually it's something minor? These are valid concerns, but they're not, we learn through precedent, we learn through experience, and so on and so forth. So we can get around them. And the other thing they should be terrified by is those stories, and James Murray was here last year, of parents complaining to the media that their university knew their child had problems and didn't tell the parent, and it ended up in a catastrophe and sometimes suicide. They should be terrified of the negative media coverage about those things, just as they're terrified about getting it right. But, if we all work together and there are good guidelines, then we can crack this.
Can we crack it, Joanna?
Sorry, excuse me. I think we need to be very careful about what in loco parentis means. And I think we also need to remember that universities at the moment, my understanding, unless somebody wants to correct me, universities are actually legally not in loco parentis at this point in time. I don't think universities, and I would say this for schools as well, universities and schools can never, with the best will in the world, can never take on parental responsibility. And in loco parentis brings with it, for schools, a set of legal standards. But there's something special about the relationship between a parent and a child that simply cannot be replicated en masse. So if you take schools and teachers, where we very definitely are talking about children, a teacher standing in front of a class of 30 that they see for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, even if that teacher is the most phenomenally brilliant teacher in the world, there is no way they can replicate the parental relationship. The parental relationship between a parent and child is something of very, very individual, dynamic that simply cannot be replicated. I think, though, to come to the points that you're getting at, massification has changed the relationship between lecturers and students. Of course it has. When I was at university and I had problems, I could go and speak to my lecturer without any problem at all. You just knocked on the door and you had a chat with them. Clearly, when you're one in a crowd of 100 and your lecturer says, well, my office hours are 5 till 6 on a Friday, don't come and bother me outside to that time, it's far more difficult to develop that personal relationship. I think for me, though, the problem is what we've replaced that personal relationship with, because of having lower staff-student ratios, has become an en masse thing where we kind of give students lectures or poster campaigns en masse, and we send out the message to all of them: you are all vulnerable, you are all at risk, you all need to go and pet the dog outside the library because you're stressed about your exams. And the one student who has some really serious problems doesn't get the individual attention they need.
All right, another one. Say who you are.
Hello, I'm Rosemary Sage, School of Education at Buckingham. The fact is the frontal lobe, responsible for reasoning, judgment and awareness of the consequence of our actions, doesn't develop until our early 30s. When I was at university, there was one counsellor there at the university. Now, at the same university, there's 120 plus. You know, what is this about, really? Clearly, our young people aren't coping at university.
Let's make a question about neuroscience. We know a lot more about how people develop. Surely 18 isn't the right age.
So what is the right age? I mean,
30 apparently.
I know. Well, there is the idea that the brain stops developing at any given point is ludicrous. Of course it doesn't. You don't even need... I'm no neuroscientist, but you don't need to be a neuroscientist to know that the brain is a continually plastic organ. It carries on developing. We just, at some particular point, tend to call that deterioration rather than development. So to decide, you could decide that actually the point when the brain stops developing is when you're an adult. In other words, when you die. I'm sorry, we're going to condemn everybody to be children for their entire lives at this rate.
Chris. Certainly not going to do that. Just very, very quickly wanted to go back on the previous point. The Vice-Chancellor of Lancaster University, now I think moving to Southampton, made the point at our admissions conference last year that with the massification of higher education, whenever you put that, most universities had expanded hugely, completely underestimated the amount that their, if you like, support services would have to expand. And I think that's been, not in a university like this, which is smaller, but I think that was generally recognised.
Okay, more hands in the air, please. Let's go right to the back if I can. I can see a lady in orange. And we'll take another one. And we'll take another one. There's a hand in the air just in front. So we'll take those two at the same time.
Hi,
and that will be it, I'm afraid.
I'm Sarah MacDonald. I'm the Disability Officer at the University of Buckingham. I've heard a lot of sort of binary thinking here, that you are either a child or an adult, that it's a linear process. You start as a child, you become an adult, and that's it. You can never go back. I heard the phrase, we have to draw a line somewhere, even if it's artificial. My question is, do we really? If we talk about the 20% of students that talk about, that have disclosed whether, they've said whether they want their information disclosed to their parents, those are dynamic figures. They will change all of the time, and having a blanket policy is too simplistic. So do we have to draw a line?
And then there was a hand in the air just in front of you. Could you pass the mic forward?
Yeah, so Emma Potts from the University of Buckingham, the COO here. My question sort of follows on from that, I guess. Johnny spoke quite convincingly, I think, about the makeup of the panel this morning and the fact that there isn't a student there, or an 18-year-old, which I think perhaps in hindsight would have been useful. But I think what the HEPI, if I've got this right, what the HEPI Student Experience, Academic Experience Survey showed us was that students were saying that in exceptional circumstances, they would like their parents or guardians to be contacted. And I guess my question is, if they'd have actually been given more detail, would they have actually answered that question differently? So how do we categorise as an institution what exceptional means? I think that's a key point.
Okay, lovely. That's easy, because that's one for each side. Johnny, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to accuse you of binary thinking.
I'm going to say no. If that's a yes-no question, I say no. In summary, 2 points I wanted to make. Just because you're willing to let your parents be your next of kin does not make you a child. My mother was my next of kin for a very long time after I was an adult, basically until my wife became my next of kin. And also, let's remember, referring to parents, if you have a mental health issue, often parents may be part of the problem, and that's the last person that it could even be dangerous to somebody to say, we're going to inform your parents. So I just want to point that out. And
we're running out of time. So.
My other point, which I do think just needs to be said, is money. This is really about money and financial independence, and we shouldn't be saying people are children because they're not financially independent. In fact, we should be making students financially independent, but that's another thing.
Okay, Nick, quick response and the question about exceptional. and then we're going to.
Do we need to draw a line somewhere? On some things we do, like driving, on other things we don't. I think it is a process. Why isn't there a student on the panel? Well, fair point. We have a student here working for HEPI on our stall next door, Mia, sitting down here. Do go and chat to her, and she'll tell you what life as a student currently is like. Exceptional, yeah, the question was exceptional. Some students also said under any circumstances, and as the lady in white was saying, as Johnny was talking, these are opt-in things. No one has to give their parents contact details. So that if you don't want to be part of that, if your parents are part of the problem,
Okay.
Correct, or a name, doesn't even have to be a parent.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
This has been good.
Correct.
I'm pleased to see people engaging. But unfortunately, we have been given a very tight time slot. So I'm going to ask the panel to wind up. And I'm going to ask them to wind up in reverse order from how they spoke the first time. So, Johnny Rich, 1 minute.
Actually, I'll forego my minute because I made my 2 points just then. Thank you.
Oh, well,
Okay.
Nick in that case.
Well, so
was very good of you.
debates by their very nature are binary, though I think we've both taken a slightly more nuanced position than maybe the motion. But as we've been thinking, I've been thinking about, some of you may know the Harry Enfield sketch where Kevin the teenager becomes a teenager. And he goes to bed as a very well-behaved young man, a child, and he wakes up as a teenager and he's knuckle dragging and he won't do anything his parents say. And, it's very funny because it has a ring of truth. But it's also funny because it's a complete and utter exaggeration because that's not how aging works. And it's the same with adulthood. You don't suddenly become an adult. It's a process. We all need support in our lives, and we need more support when we're younger. Mental health conditions show themselves. They're different to physical conditions because they show themselves between the ages of 16 and 24, typically. So it's a particular age of your life where you need support. I would say at least up to your mid-20s for some respects. But I'm not arguing, my last point, I'm not actually arguing for radical changes, for example, to the final year of university life. What I'm asking in terms of higher education is for a change to the first and second years. So you're diving in more slowly. It's a more gradual process. Because as Anthony Selden from here has often said, nothing magical happens in those 3 months between leaving school and joining university. Thank you.
It's pretty good. Joanna.
So we've heard from a speaker on the floor today that young people are clearly not coping. We've heard from HEPI that there's a demand among students at universities for, in exceptional circumstances, their parents to be contacted if they are facing a crisis. Now, I hate the term snowflakes, and it's not a term that I have ever used in a positive sense, but there is clearly a perception among young people themselves that adulthood is not something that they are finding easy to deal with. And I think we, as adults, not young people, not young people themselves, we should not be calling them snowflakes and laughing at them. That's completely unhelpful. But I think we as adults need to take a good long look at ourselves. What have we done to this young generation that's made them feel like they can't cope when they hit 18? Why are young people not chomping at the bit to be adults? Personally, I think us, people my age and people older than me, should be embarrassed, quite frankly, and ashamed of what we've done to the younger generation. I think two things. I think we've scared them silly. I'll be very, very quick. We've scared them silly about mental health. This constant reiteration of young people as being vulnerable, young people being at risk of mental health conditions, means they've lost all ability to differentiate between a serious mental health condition and feeling a bit worried about their exams, feeling a bit down in the dumps, which is actually a perfectly normal feature of adolescence. But we've robbed them of that ability to differentiate between those two states. And that's really worrisome, I think, and really unhelpful. I think the second thing that we've done that's really terrible is we've robbed them of the aspiration and expectation, the enjoyment, the pleasure, the freedom, the autonomy that comes with adulthood. We've taken that excitement, that positive aspiration away from them. We've problematized adulthood to such an extent that it's no longer a positive aspiration for young people.
Right.
18 is artificial, totally, I accept that, but we need this artificial age to act as an expectation and an aspiration.
Well, you took Johnny's minute as well.
He let me.
Chris, last word.
Very, very quickly. I mean, life has obviously changed enormously, and we've had a bit of a history lesson today. You know, we were all of us marking the end of the First World War recently, and in schools we were talking about these young 16-year-olds, even younger sometimes, going off to... That would be inconceivable today. Life is different. We're living longer. We're living much, much, much more complex lives. So I would just say we're absolutely all for aspiration and expectation, but simply saying you are now an adult, when what I think we would argue is you're on that journey to adulthood, is like saying, you know, you're a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, you're a Premiership footballer. You can aspire to these things, and that's wonderful. I'm absolutely all in favour of that, of course I am, but simply saying you are it is very different. I would just say, you know, let's remember the motion actually is that they are children, not adults. Not that parenting is bad. We're fully in favour of risk. We're just not in favour of switching, flipping a switch at the age of 18. And my sense is that that's something we probably all deep down agree on.
Right.
We'll see.
This is the final denouement. It's the vote. The House believes 18-year-olds are still children and not adults. It was a quarter in favour, half against, a quarter didn't know. So I'm going to say everyone has to vote. That quarter who didn't vote have to vote. Right, those in favour of the motion, hands in the air, please. Those against the motion, I'm afraid you've been defeated. Can you join me in saying thank you very much to our fantastic
I don't think I
panel?
had all the information.
Joanna, Johnny, Nick,
Thank you.
Chris. Subscribe to the TES.
And can I just say there is a second HEPI debate tomorrow on whether boys are being let down in the education system. So please do
Or young
come
men.
along to that as well. Thank you.